interest of time, I want to go ahead and get started. We're about 5 minutes after the hour, and so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in just a moment. But before we get started, I first want to introduce myself. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, or if I've never had the pleasure of meeting you, which as I was looking at the participant list, I was like, oh, I don't know most of these people, which is awesome, which is amazing. So I want to welcome you and say thank you for taking time on a Friday afternoon to really have this conversation. I look forward to all the engagement that will happen. So far, the poll question, a lot of people have given some great responses, and so we're going to use those responses going forward. I am a human capital consultant. My company is Content That Matters, where we rescue geniuses, and I love that I get to do this with two other awesome women. So they're also going to be a part of this discussion and helping to moderate in the chat. So I want to introduce Bella and also Adriana. So they're on camera, and you will see Bella. Bella actually has a session where she's going to talk about some of the things that we've been looking at from a research standpoint and data standpoint as it relates to oil and gas, but also as it relates to systemic racism in corporate America. And then Adriana is our back-end guru. She is making sure that everything in this production keeps running and keeps going. So if you have questions, you can enter them in chat, and either one of them will respond. So I'm going to quickly move on to the next slide. And I want to start with this question. So we did the welcome. You just had this question around what are these challenges that are happening in your organization? So you've talked a little bit about the challenges. Now I want you to think about how equipped are your leaders right now to address the challenges. And you have a few options. So again, you're going to enter in the poll. Either they're not equipped at all, they're very equipped, but they're not committed. You can say, hey, I'm not really sure. They're somewhat equipped, very equipped, not really equipped at all. So I'll leave this open. We just want to kind of get a gauge for where your leadership is in your company, as well as just your perception of it, right? Because we have multiple companies that are represented here in this session. And so we don't want to assume that everyone has the same experience. All right. I'm seeing some. So far, I see somewhere it's fluctuating between 45 to 55% are saying not really equipped at all. What's interesting is that I see, well, it just changed, but it was 12% who said they're equipped, but they're not committed. And the reason why we have that as an option is because you can have leadership that actually is equipped. They have the tools, they have the resources, they have maybe even the right people, but if they're not committed to the actual cause and committed to the change, then it still won't be fruitful. So I love these responses. So it looks like B is 25% somewhat equipped. So that's good. And then, but the category I think that got the most votes is not really equipped at all. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And what we hope to do in this session is actually give you some things that you can take back to your leadership, that you can take back to your organization. So I'm going to move on from this poll question, and we'll come back again to that first question later on in the session. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. And again, I'm just so thankful for all of you who have decided to join us today. I remember the first week in June, and during that first week in June, I was showing up to sessions out of breath. I was showing up to meetings, whether it was on MS Teams or Zoom, and these are professional meetings, not just to hang out with family and friends and not virtual happy hours, but these were professional meetings I was showing up to with clients and colleagues, and I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't even stop the tears, and I didn't realize how much I had been triggered by the events that were dominating our news cycle. And so I kept just kind of searching for this place where I could catch my breath, where I could actually exhale, even though that exhale wasn't pretty. Like it was ugly. I mean, I've pulled myself together today, but I can remember back to that first week in June when I was going to meetings, and I mean, I had no makeup on. I'm not really a crier when it comes to crying in public, but I would just start talking and the tears would start flowing. And I wasn't even talking about the murder of George Floyd. I was talking about business, but I just could not suppress the feeling anymore. And so I kept looking for this safe space to be able to express that. And I couldn't really find it, so I created it. And so that's how Bold X Brave was born. But I didn't create this space for myself. Honestly, what I found in a lot of private conversations is that there were people from all walks of life. There were Black people, and there were white people, and there were Asian people, and there were people that I knew and people who I didn't know who needed a safe space to be able to exhale. And they also needed a space to be able to figure out what to do and also give themselves permission to get it wrong. Because when we're trying to figure out something that's so heavy like this, we might get it wrong, and it's okay. So I want to share this space with you all. We are not going to get everything solved in this webinar this afternoon, but what I hope is that it will plant a seed and it will spark something in you to take back to your organization, to take back to your families, your colleagues, your friends. And if you really think about how we all have an opportunity to really influence change, it starts with each individual. And so I'm really excited that you're here. I'm so glad, so thankful that you joined us today. And we're gonna get into some content and then we're gonna get into some conversation. So I wanna talk about our goals and agreements. This part is really important because, again, we wanna be clear about this is conversation not just to be talking, this is conversation that ultimately leads to strategic action. That is the whole point of us doing this series. And that is the whole point of what we do with clients when we're working with them to try to figure out, hey, what's the next thing that we do? We made a statement, now what? And so this is not just about talking. We want to make sure that we have some clear goals. So we want meaningful engagement around the racial inequities that exist in corporate America. And for this session, we want to specifically focus on oil and gas. We want to build awareness and spark actionable ideas. So by giving you some information, some tools, some things that maybe you hadn't thought about yet, I think this can also help you take that back to your organization and say, hey, we didn't really know what to do, but in my small group or in the people who are in my department, we can start doing this today. And then we also want to provide that safe space that I talked about. So again, I don't assume that I'm the only person who's grappling with this. I don't assume that there aren't others who are feeling overwhelmed by it. Some of you even responded in the poll questions. They're like, hey, it's overwhelming. I want to do something about it, but I'm not really sure what to do. So our agreements today include just making sure that there are no public attributions without permission of the individual. So if Adriana tells a story about how she used to work at the Microsoft store and how there was a white guy who was on her team who kept cutting her hours at the Microsoft store and he was treating her unfairly. Let's say she tells that story, right? And so you think it's a really great story to share with other people, which it probably is, but I just ask that you get Adriana's permission first. As an example, that didn't really happen, but get her permission first before sharing it. So that includes like on LinkedIn, that includes anywhere else. Just let's get permission just to honor this space. We also want to honor people who are bold and brave enough to speak up and to talk about their experiences. In our 2 previous sessions, we have had people from all genders, races, walks of life to come on camera and talk about their experiences, their frustrations, their breakthrough moments, their questions. And so we want to continue that for this session. And so it's really, really important that we honor them even if you don't agree with what they're saying. And then we're going to respect all genuine questions, even if they're uncomfortable. And so obviously we want you all to ask questions, and it's okay if it's uncomfortable. So just for my peace of mind, if you will in chat enter I agree, just so I know that you all are agreeing with us. So if you could just say in chat, I agree. I see some people saying they agree. I see some more saying they agree, I agree. Excellent. Just so we can get some agreements, because I feel better moving forward with our conversation when I know that we have total agreement, we have consensus in this group. So I want to talk about the 3 forms of bold, brave, and engagement. So this is where we talk about how you can engage with us today in this session. So number one, we have this opportunity where you can come on camera and audio. You can share your stories, your experiences, and your questions. And like I mentioned before, each session, we have people that kind of raise their hand for this. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon that allows you to raise your hand. And then if you raise your hand, we will transfer you to be a panelist. And so I see one person, Stacy, already raised her hand. I see some others. So the people who are returning, you know how this works, you know how this goes. And if you think you want to say something, it's going to be important to raise your hand now, because we had a lot of interest in this particular session. So each time we've had about 10 people or so come on camera and talk, so plus or minus a few. And so I don't know if we'll have more this time or less, but if you are interested in sharing your story and being on camera like you would in a normal Zoom session, then please raise your hand, and then Adriana will actually start moving you over to panelists when we get to that section. You can also enter questions in the Q&A module. So we'll do our best to answer them, but the beauty of this is other people can also answer your questions, and you all have an opportunity to upvote questions. So if there are multiple questions that are all sort of the same, then you can upvote, or if you see a question and you say, oh yeah, that was my question too, you can upvote that question. In our previous sessions, we've had questions. We had, in our first session, one of the VPs from Chevron attended, and he said, hey, how do I retain Black engineers? I've been trying for over 10 years and I can't get them to stay. I can recruit them, but I can't retain them. And he's a white man, right? And he genuinely was asking that question. He posed it in the Q&A, and we had several people who were on camera who answered it, and we also had some people who answered it directly in the Q&A. So that's just one example of how you can interact. And then finally, for everyone, I'd love for you to use the chat and also interact in the polls. So for those of you who have just joined, we had a couple of poll questions. We'll have a couple more before we end. If you have any questions about how to interact, and I see a few people have already raised their hand. So once your hand is raised, Adriana will be moving you over to be a panelist when we get to that section. So I'm going to turn this over to Bella. Bella's going to share a little bit about the oil and gas industry overall, and then she's also going to talk about some things that we've talked about in previous sessions that are relevant to this discussion. So Bella, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Janae. So these are just what we know about the oil and gas industry. But like Janae mentioned, we're going to open this up and would love to hear from you in addition to what we have. So we know that talent attraction and retention, there are issues in the oil and gas industry. Some organizations talking about pipeline issues, which we got into last time. And it's mainly male dominated. It's mainly white at the top levels. And a lot of oil and gas industry or companies have focused on gender diversity. So it's come up to the conversation that they can use those same programming and focus on diversity as a whole versus just focusing on gender diversity, but it's still by no means gender diverse. And then decision-making methods, command and control versus room for innovation. And what I meant by that is just the oil and gas industry is very structured, very procedural, and things are done a certain way because there's the belief that, well, we've always done it this way, so why do we need to change? And that definitely stifles innovation. And so that's something that's an area that there's definitely room for improvement. In addition, pay is very secretive. And in situations like this, if everyone is secretive about their pay, then it makes conversations about pay equity more difficult. And then lastly, the oil and gas environment is changing, and it's changing from a workforce perspective. So the workforce is changing, and with a changing workforce, there needs to be programming that supports that workforce. And then in addition, with the fall in oil prices, there's also room for improvement there in terms of the oil and gas doing different things or doing things differently now, just to help innovation. Now, for the rest of my presentation, I spoke about this last time, but I think it's it's even more relevant for everyone on this call because it's specific to the oil and gas industry. So I shared a short story last time about my husband. He is a Black professional who works in a global oil and gas organization, and he got his performance reviews recently. He was rated very good versus excellent, even though he thought that he deserved excellent. So he asked, what can I do next time to get there? And wasn't really getting much back. So he pushed again, and the manager kind of just mumbled, well, sometimes it's more of a personality thing that can be because of your cultural background. Some personalities are more laid back, so that can be seen as not taking initiative. And we were both very shocked by this statement because we know that these things, unconscious bias goes into decision-making and promotions, but the fact that the manager actually said it out loud was shocking. And so what I want to draw from that story is the importance of mentorship and sponsorship in corporate America. And this study was done, This study was done by the Center for Talent Innovation, and it just shows that 65% of Black professionals feel that they are ambitious in their careers, compared to 53% of white professionals. So this shows that the lack of representation in organizations, the lack of representation in leadership is not due to lack of desire, it's just due to lack of access. And then in addition, 31% of Black professionals feel that they have access to senior leadership as compared to 44% of white professionals. So again, here's the difference. If 65% of Black professionals feel that they're ambitious, but they only have so much access to leadership opportunities, then that can definitely cause disparity in representation or promotions or access to high visibility roles. So like Janae mentioned, we got a lot of questions about retention and how can we retain Black employees. And specific to the oil and gas industry, a mentorship and sponsorship is something that came up that can definitely be used in that industry. And I know that some oil and gas companies have structured mentorship programs, but today we're really going to be shining a light on the importance of sponsorship. So a mentor is anyone in a position of experience. They suggest ways to expand the mentee's network. They advise the mentee and help them build their career vision. However, a sponsor is a senior level executive with decision-making power. They give their proteges their active network connections and make new connections for them. And they advocate for their protege and help drive their career vision. The reason this is so important is, in continuation to my story, I asked my husband, well, how were your reviews prior? And he used to work in a different location, office location, same company. And he said, I've never been rated very good. And my old boss will never let me be rated very good because of my laid back personality. And this is something that he's going to struggle with for the rest of his career if he doesn't change his personality. And that's an issue for a lot of Black professionals who feel that they need to be a culture fit, which is problematic all by itself. But so these studies and these what we've seen is just showing us that Black professionals will not stay in organizations that make them change their personality to progress. They won't stay in organizations that they can't see representation in leadership, and they won't stay in organizations that they don't have access to leaders, they don't have access to promotions. And while a lot of Black professionals have mentor opportunities, they have people that are willing to listen to them, they don't have enough sponsors in their careers. And so they need more sponsors. And so this just shows that, and also there are studies that have shown that mentorship and sponsorship are mutually beneficial relationships. So there's really no reason not to sponsor someone. So, in summary, sponsor someone. But I'm going to turn it over to Janae, who's going to talk about looking in your network for individuals.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you for sharing that. So based on what Bella just shared, these are some things that we asked the audience actually when we did this session 2 weeks ago. So if you were with us 2 weeks ago, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in chat around what you actually did. Was there anything that you looked at? Was there anything that changed in terms of your view? I know we had a few people last time who talked about the importance of understanding sponsorship, right? That like, hey, I wasn't really aware. We had a white executive male who said, you know what, you're right, I hadn't thought about sponsorship. I hadn't thought about being intentional around that sponsorship. And so if you joined us last time, you remember these questions to consider, then please enter in chat what you've actually done, or maybe some things that you've thought about since then. For those of you who are seeing this for the first time, I want to just go through this quickly. So for our Black employees, and really this applies to probably everyone, but I want you to think about who is on your team right now. So if you take inventory of your sponsors, your mentors, your peers, and your mentees, and you find that, you know what, I have a few peers, but I don't really have a strong mentor, I don't really have a strong sponsor, and I'm not giving back or pouring into anyone else, then it's important to have all four of those roles. And when I say on your team, I mean like your personal team, right? So for me, I have Team Janae, and I have mentors, and I have sponsors, and I have mentees, and I have peers. So I have people who are along the journey with me. And then I have, those are my peers. And then I have people that I'm pouring into, that I'm sharing what I know and what I learned, and even the non-examples and the failures and the pitfalls. And then I have sponsors and mentors. And the thing about my sponsors is that these are the people who will prop the door open for me, right? These are the people who will introduce me to the right people. These are the people who will let me know about opportunities, put in a good word for me. And so if you think about how corporations work, and it's no different in oil and gas, you need those sponsorships in order for someone to say, hey, you know what, come join my team, or hey, there's this highly visible project that's about to kick off. I think you'd be a great fit for it. And it's really going to give you a lot of visibility across the organization. That is sponsorship. That's an example of it. For leaders, think about who's in your organization and how can I help drive their career. So can I sponsor them? And if I'm not the right person, who can I connect them with? And then finally, is there a Black colleague that you've overlooked? Where can you start a relationship? And so we want to be clear about, in the language, we're talking about Black colleagues and Black employees, and particularly in oil and gas, specifically because a lot of this work is in response to what's been happening really around the world, but definitely centered in the US, and was sparked by these brutal images of Black people being killed publicly. But I want to just note that this also, once we figure out this piece of it, and if you as a leader, as an independent contributor, as a colleague, if you can figure out this part for Black employees, then understand that it applies to so much of what you do in your organization. But just wanted to clarify, that's why we have the questions to consider in that way. So in our next segment, we are moving on to now it is your turn. So for those of you who raised your hand to be panelists, and Adriana will start moving you over, we're gonna see some new faces on camera. So as much as I love being on camera, kind of, sort of, I would love to have some other people join us. And so I think Stacy is our first panelist. Is Stacy our only panelist today? Who's Stacy? Yes, so far. So wait a minute, wait, stop everything. So we have, according to my list, 47 participants, and we have one person that raised their hand. All I'm saying is in our previous sessions, we had at least 10. So I'll leave that there. We're gonna go to Stacy, and we'll see who else is bold, brave enough to have these conversations. Now, mind you, if you don't have audio or video access, that's fine, let us know. But it would be really helpful for this conversation if you all start engaging in the chat, or if you are bold, brave enough to come on camera, or just on audio, no camera. So Stacy, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us again. My first question to you is, what were some of the takeaways from last time when you joined, and thinking about what's going on at your particular company and some of the challenges that you all are facing? What are some things that you were able to either apply, or it gave you an idea, or anything like that?
Sure. Hello, everybody, and thank you. I appreciate everything that you're doing, Janae, first of all. And second of all, there was one particular thing that stood out to me, probably more than anything that was said. And there was a gentleman who said, I don't need a mentor or a sponsor, I need an accomplice. And I was like, holy cow, like it just hit. Like I understood it so very well. And I think the point that he was making is that it's absolutely great to have conversations. You have to have conversations in order to move the needle and in order to capture the sentiment of the things that are happening. But it is critically important to understand, who's kind of your board of directors and who's going to actually get in there, roll their sleeves up, and do the work with you. So it's not about, you need someone to help guide you. You need someone to just talk to off the cuff, but you also need to understand who's there to support you with action. Mm-hmm. So actionable steps to help move the needle. So that was probably the biggest and most important thing, the greatest aha moment that I had last week.
So Stacey, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I want to just clarify for those of you who may not have followed all the comments. There's a lot of talk about allyship. There's a lot of talk about advocacy. And there's definitely, last time and today we talked about mentorship and sponsorship. But think about, if someone is your accomplice, they are in the trenches with you.
Yes.
A lot of times allyship can feel like, and I'm speaking as a Black woman, it can feel like to me that there's someone from a distance who is very hands-off, who cares about what's happening, and they may be willing to lend their resources or willing to lend their expertise or their listening ear or their ideas, but they are not in it with me. So think about the difference, the contrast of being an ally, which is definitely important, versus actually being an accomplice, and how that changes the way you even think about your behavior around it.
Yep.
So that was a good point, Stacey. I want to go to the chat. We had a question that came up. So Caroline asked, how do you coach an introvert who does not network and feels the need to network equals a change in his or her personality? And so if we think about someone, so think about the story that Bella told about her husband, and he's laid back. It's a part of his personality. But what's happening is that it starts to reflect on sometimes his performance, that there's this perception that, oh, he's not a good culture fit, or he's not really ambitious because he's laid back. So Stacey, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is, I'm laughing because I feel like this has been the entire career. It's either you have to choose to do, and I'm not even going to call it networking. I'm going to call it the forced fun things, activities that happen where you actually build your network. So it's going to, happy hour after work. Well, I've worked for 8, 10, 12 hours, and I may not necessarily feel that I want to spend the time that is considered mine outside of the people who I actually, want to spend time with. And it's finding, or just realizing that there have to be different ways for people to connect. There have to be different ways outside of, things that involved alcohol, food, going to baseball games. I mean, and for some, those are fun, but they may not necessarily be culturally the things that other people want to do. So you can't, I think we have to shift our mindset and think about, is Stacey saying that she doesn't want to go because she's got other things to do, or she's saying she doesn't want to go because those are not the things that she wants to do in her off time? Or is there another event that maybe we can rally around that might be a little culturally diverse for us to do as a team? So it's kind of putting the mindset in, is this the only thing that we can do to network? Is there something else that we can do that will allow us the same type of interaction and the same type of getting to understand and know each other outside of those things? So
yeah, that's a good response. And I think a lot of times we don't even consider that. So back to Caroline's question, there may be some ways, and I don't know what your relationship is with this person, if you are in a position to sponsor them, or if you're in a position to mentor them, to find other ways to connect with them, and also encourage them to find other ways to connect with others. Because to Stacy's point, they may not want to go to an Astros game and hang out, and knowing that a lot of the networking might happen there. That may not be their thing. Or they truly may be introverted. And so for them, a one-on-one conversation might be better. Or, you know, they can do public events, but maybe they're not going to be that person who talks to everyone at a conference when they go to a conference. So yes, that was definitely a good point. I see we have a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. So Brittany says, does anyone have experience with establishing or official mentoring sponsorship circles within an organization? And if so, can you recommend any resources for trying to get management to buy in? That's a really good question. So I want to open that up to Stacey. You absolutely can answer, but then also there are a few people in chat. So I'm going to give you all just a moment. Oh, I see someone else raise their hand, because I want to make sure that we get Brittany's question answered. So if you have ideas around this, please enter your ideas in chat. You can also enter your answer in the Q&A. You can upvote Brittany's question. And so I think this is a really good question, because a lot of times, Brittany, I know what I've seen is that there's a desire, right, to have these kind of organizations. But how do we actually set them up to be successful? And how do you get management to see how they're necessary? So how do you tie them back to the actual business goals? One of the things that we're going to share later in this broadcast is just a cheat sheet, right, of how to have conversations one-on-one, how to have conversations with your teams, and how to have these conversations with leadership. And in the category of leadership, we recommend that you start talking to your leaders in terms of what they've said their strategic imperatives are, and talking about how these organizations are going to help further the strategic imperative, whatever that might be. So all companies have something that they're focused on right now. A lot of companies, particularly in oil and gas, are focused around digital transformation. So how do you tie into, and that's just one example, but how do you tie that back in would be one recommendation. So I see a few people who are responding. I see a few people who are also responding in chat. So the chat is blowing up. I like it. All right. And we have another panelist, is that right? Adriana, we have somebody else that raised their hand?
She's in. It's Keisha. Keisha's in.
Okay, Keisha, are we saying your name correctly? You're on mute.
Yes, that is correct. It is Keisha. That's wonderful.
Yay.
So often not.
Yeah, Keisha, so welcome. So this really, the floor is yours. You can answer a question, you can ask a question, or you can just kind of share your experience. It's really up to you.
Thank you very much. So I didn't attend, actually I just found out about this session a couple of days ago. So I wish I had known about your previous session. So thank you very much for what you're doing. But I actually wanted to share an experience and pose it as a question of how we can do better. So I'm in the oil and gas industry and have been for close to 25 years now. The early part of my career was on the contractor side. The latter part of my career has been in a oil and gas major. So when I joined the company I'm with now, an oil and gas major, it's a global company, not an American company. And one of the first kind of trainings and leadership development type events and courses that was offered to me, because I was seen as talent worth investing in, was a course called Persons of Color Efficacy Class. Yeah. I see your reaction, Jeanette.
Okay, yeah, say more about that, please.
So it was a week-long leadership development opportunity, phrased that way, for people of color, and in my particular case, it was all African American males and females in the organization. To help us to become more effective as leaders in the space of being a person of color. So that was one of my first kind of introductions of being the minority, in this case, an African American, being trained to fit into a culture. Another example is on the female side, the gender side. Another course I attended was for female leaders. And the majority of that class, we looked at various studies being done by third parties that talked about male ways of working, how males communicate to one another, and telling us these things so that then we could adjust our style to be more effective when working with men, which is primarily who you're working with in oil and gas. And I share those examples because it's just become very evident to me that most of the approaches by companies to address inequities, whether it's gender or race, is to focus on training that minority group, whatever it is, women or the people of color, whether it's Black or whatever country the company may be in. But that seems to be the main focus, is to train the minority group. Yeah. But that conversation of accomplices and allies made me think about this in the context of for any real change to happen that benefits a minority group, it really has to be the people in power, the people in leadership that can make that change happen and last and be sustainable. So I'm looking for suggestions, and now I go to the question. I'm looking for suggestions of how do we convince the leaders, those who are in power, who don't look like us, to know that it's their culture that needs to be adjusted and adapting to the minority culture, if that makes sense, and more accepting of the minority culture.
Yeah. So while you were talking, I was pulling up an article that I actually shared on LinkedIn this past week that actually addresses exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so I'll be sure that you all get a copy of this article. It's from HBR. But it's talking about moving beyond diversity towards racial equity. And essentially the article it looks at how companies and cultures up until this point have looked at how can we make other people fit into our culture. So how do we mold them? We'll bring them in, we'll do them a favor and bring them into our organization, but how do we mold them to fit us versus how do we mold our culture so that it is welcoming to all, and that it's not one of those things that has to be, that I have to shift who I have to change who I am in order to fit in. So Keisha, when you said that you had I'm still at a loss for words, that there was a class that sounded like, and maybe I got this wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like, let me show you how to mute yourself so that you will be successful.
Pretty much. That class doesn't exist anymore. Let me just say that. but I mean, I kept the material from it because just the title alone, just was something that says, here's something to, well, one, that there's a reason why you're not effective, and it's connected to your race or how you look, or that's what really struck me, even in the title of the course. Now, mind you, in the content of the course, there was some very good content, but it was more because of the participants sharing with each other, not really the intent of the course.
Yeah. So I want to make sure, Keisha, that we get your question answered. So I see Stephanie joined us. Hey, Stephanie, thank you for joining again. Stephanie is one of our returning panelists. And so Stephanie, Stacy, or anyone else, if we could address Keisha's question. And Keisha, could you just rephrase it, please, so that Stephanie can address it? And then Stephanie, whatever else you have to add as well.
Sure. So I shared all of that to say, okay, so how do we sort of change the view of the persons who are in power in our companies to recognize that it's the culture that needs to adapt, and not the individuals, not the minority individuals, but it's more the culture that needs to adapt. So stop training the the impacted group and train the non-affected group, if that makes
Absolutely.
So Keisha, I would have to say that what you just said, it just felt like a gut punch to hear the title of that course. I mean, the minute you said it, it really did. So I guess I've kind of got something that maybe hits both on Brittany and Keisha's a little bit. At my company, it was a really big company and it had the funds and resources to start ERGs, right? But hadn't done it. And what it took was one person, which happened to be me, getting mad enough to start something. And so, Brittany, I would say the way to start that is to kind of gather your allies, right? And so whether that's starting an ERG, starting a mentoring circle or sponsoring circle, it's finding people that you trust and workshopping it and coming up with that. I hate to call it a business plan anymore because everybody should get the business case for diversity. I'm done with that, right? So it's just the plan of what's your mission? What are you going to do with this group? And the people that will be in your circle to decide that will decide what that means for you specifically, right? So within my company, our focus was on women and our focus was on getting more women in leadership. And it was very focused because we had a lot of, say, 30-something women that were trying to get into those leadership positions. Now, it would be different based on the makeup of your group. So you focus on that and you decide what you want to do. And to me, Keisha, that starts to address some of the culture problems in a company because we had the same thing. Energy and construction industry, just, there's just not any women or whatever, right? And as you develop ideas for programming, unfortunately, this puts everything on you and it puts nothing on the company. Right? All of these ideas do, but that's the start. And so at the very beginning, I spent all of my time convincing people that what we were doing wasn't scary and that it was good for the company and saying, these are the things that we are going to do because this is what we need. And then what we ended up with was other people that were jealous. They're like, well, this programming that the women are getting, it's so wonderful. Why can't I be involved? Show up, come. It's good for everybody. It's not about changing women. It's about making good leaders. And part of making a good leader is somebody that can be inclusive, right? And so unfortunately, I feel like a lot of what I've done with the men in my industry is water things down a bit, right? So I had one session with executives where I gave them a session on bias and I explained that tall men get more opportunities than short men because that was a little more, could work with their frame of mind. It wasn't quite as in your face. And so I'd say, kind of back to my general, I'd say for Brittany, it's your core team, figure out what you want and make your mission. And then for Keisha, it's about how to slowly develop, kind of put that out there in the least scary way, but just keep fighting the culture. And I have to say, I didn't win. I made movements, right? I got to the point where my CEO would commit to KPIs, right? Which felt like a huge win. So you just get those incremental wins for culture.
Yeah. Can I jump back in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
So thanks for that, Stephanie. And I also see a comment in the chat from so I don't know if I should say a name. I don't know how this works, but I see a comment from someone saying they just realized that through their years of being in women leadership classes, that the underlying implication was that women should be more like men. And still, I mean, Stephanie, you made some great points, but I think it's really the fact that we probably don't even recognize that most of the training that's geared towards any minority group, women in this particular example, and then the other example I gave you before, it is really geared toward, here's how you can be a better fit. Here's what you need to do to fit or to be more effective. Here are the characteristics or the traits you should adopt that would make you more effective. And the underlying theme there is that you have to change. You have to be something different. And to the person who asked the question, Janae, that you said earlier, why they can't retain the executive that said they couldn't retain Black engineers. That's one of the main reasons is you get in and you realize, man, I have to change so much of myself to fit and be successful here. And you get to a certain age and a certain maturity level to where that's just not worth it anymore.
Right.
And you move on to greener pastures. And I've been in this game a long time, so I bumped up against those things, and sometimes I adapt out of necessity, and sometimes I don't. But the fact that we have to make those choices tells me that the culture still isn't there yet. So.
Yeah, so Keisha, that's such a good point. And just listening to you, I'm thinking about, and for those of you I'm just meeting, this is your first time interacting, as a consultant, I've worked for, I think at this point, 6 oil and gas companies, most of them majors. And so I've seen this behavior, I've experienced this behavior. And I think up until this point, there's always this exercise that I would do that I didn't even realize I was doing it, right? Where it was all about making sure that other people, so the culture, was comfortable with who I was. And that was the priority above anything else. And then if for some reason I did something, said something, braided my hair a certain way, whatever it is, and that made them uncomfortable, then I would note the reaction, and then like you, Keisha, I would decide like, okay, am I going to just sort of put an asterisk next to that person's name, knowing, okay, you showed me who you are, so I'm going to move on. And for the sake of progress or reaching a goal or completing a project, I'm just going to stay and deal with this. Or am I going to move around and do something else, right? And so, but it was this conscious decision-making process that was happening every single time. And I think that's the part, like all of the unspoken internal struggle that happens that I know I have experienced as a Black woman working in oil and gas, that my colleagues and my friends never even knew about. They weren't even aware of it, because it wasn't something that I was walking around with a poster saying, hey, I'm struggling with XYZ, or you said something disrespectful to me, or this person is treating me differently. But it was something that I experienced a lot of. And so, I mean, I think you just bring up a good point about you've been in the game a long time, so you know how to decide if you're going to stay or if you're going to leave. And it speaks to the issue of retention.
Can I add one more thing, Janae? Oh,
yes, go ahead.
I think Stacy just raised her hand.
Yeah, she did, but go ahead.
So we've been grappling with this within the organization that I'm in, and one of the things that we were going to try to figure out how to implement in this is, how do you build empathy within the majority group, whatever is the majority group that you're working with. And I would like to share a story. I do have permission to share the story because I've shared it before, but it's not my experience. But a colleague of mine worked in a different part of the organization, and he was the only Black male in his group. And as one of their team building events, they all went to a college football game. That was the big school in the city that a lot of folks went to in that state. And it's a majority school, very large university. And they all went to the football game and had a really good time. And he was one of the few, Black people even in the stadium, let alone just in his group. So he decided to return the favor with his line manager and take his line manager to his university football game, which is an HBCU in the same city. So they went to, and it was just the two of them. He took his boss to the game, and they had a really good time. But he said his boss was looked over at him at one point in the game and said, "This is really a unique experience." And he said, "Well, what do you mean? Why is this a unique?" He says, "I'm the only white person in this whole section of the stadium, And so my colleague says, "Well, how do you feel about that? Are you okay?" He says, "I'm okay." He says, "Everybody treating you all right?" He said, "Yeah, everybody's really nice." He said, "But I distinctly feel different." And it was just that one incident where that built empathy in that line manager, because he had the one incident to have the feeling of how it feels to be different. or to be the minority. So now when they go back to work, just that one football game is probably enough of a training class to build the empathy in him to now treat others who are the single female, the single Black male, the single Black female, or whatever is the minority, because they've had that experience of what it felt like. So that's something we've been grappling with in our organization, is how can we create scenarios like that, where people can build the empathy of what it feels like to be different in the workplace.
So I'd love to kind of track that with you, Keisha, because I think that's a good example, right? But also, I wonder what you all will come up with, right? Because I think it's challenging to do it in a corporate space, but even things like social events and going to a HBCU football game versus going to a predominantly white university football game, two totally different experiences, but definitely being the minority at an HBCU game, it helped your colleague's boss to kind of see like, okay, so I can empathize a bit more about what it's like to be in your shoes, and maybe I can realize that, yes, I'm living this for a few hours, but this is how you live every day, especially when you're coming to work.
Yeah, I don't think the football game scenario was one they planned out. It just kind of worked out that way. So we're trying to plan out some examples, and I haven't come up with anything yet, but I'm looking for suggestions.
Well, good. So if anybody has suggestions for Keisha, please make sure you enter them in chat. My team just reminded me that I missed something, so I'm going to actually go back before we bring up our next panelist, because we had a lot of good responses that were coming up in the first poll question. And so I want to put these back on the screen, and they're going to cycle through like this. I'm putting them back on the screen because I'd love for our panelists and also for the people in chat, or if you entered one of these responses and you want to talk about it, I think they warrant a response, or at least a discussion from us, because I asked you a really, which could be a provocative question in terms of what are the challenges that your company is facing. And for those of you who joined early, you know that I asked that question, I asked you to be honest. I asked you to say whatever it was, you know, even if it wasn't pretty. And so someone said, no one in my group wants to have conversations. Someone else said silence. Someone else, they're trying to figure it out, which is a lot of people. Determining effective ways to bring culture change at work. Determining what to say, because the beliefs are so, there's a disparity in beliefs, right? So very broad beliefs on this topic across teams, figuring out how to make substantial change. And so I know we have some panelists that have already joined us. I think we have one more person who also raised their hand. We've got some stuff going on in chat. We've got some questions in Q&A that hopefully we can respond to. But I want to address some of the things that were said here and just give you all an opportunity to look at some of these comments, because I think they were, one, they're not just, it's not just you if you entered this, right? And two, I think it warrants a discussion. So if there's anyone who wants to, you can respond in chat, you can come on video, you can do audio only. To actually talk a little bit more about this. And for any of our panelists, if you see one that you really want to jump in on, please do. So I'll just leave this on the screen and see who wants to jump in.
Is it okay if I jump in again?
Go ahead.
I see two of them on there. Our Women's Employee Resource Group has a white female president, and she referred to Black, Asian as other networks. And then another one that says, I believe a D&I focus on women in leadership as D&I rather than people of color. So I guess I'd like to address this as a white woman that started a women's leadership organization, right? Yes, and so with that perspective, in my case, in my company, there were no employee resource groups, right? So the company as a whole was doing nothing for anyone that was not in the majority of the company, right? It was an energy and construction company, so it was white men dominated everywhere, right? And so as we started that ERG, it was a focus on women, right? So there was not a specific exclusion. We invited men, we invited everybody, but the focus was to get women into leadership positions. Now, once it kind of became entrenched within the company, our CEO and our management would try to claim to our board of directors that this group represents all minorities within a company. And I would have to say, as the leader as the original founder of that group, I had to say, no, it doesn't. As a women's group, I cannot represent those other groups. I don't know that experience. I can do my best to be the ally or the accomplice, but I can't do it. And so what we were struggling with was, if an ERG is the right next step, then there need to be ERGs for other focus areas. And the reason that I said that is that if I am focusing strictly on women, then I'm focusing on the challenges that women are facing, and then I can't do justice to everything. Now, if a company wants to focus and fix their entire culture, which would be the right thing, then the company does that. But you can't rely on one ERG that was started for one purpose to try to fix everything. And so that's kind of just, as I see those, I know the experience that I had. And so what we tried to do is we said, we will do what we can to fix this one group. And I've seen it happen for instance, parents groups, right? Or, you know, whatever it is, but that focus of that ERG has to be specific, or else you're going to dilute your cause and you're not going to get your message across. And I don't think there's any desire to not cross support. It's just that ERG doesn't necessarily, can't take on the role of solving the world's problems for everybody.
Yeah, and I agree, Stephanie. And I remember you and I talked about this, about, you know, it was easy for leadership to kind of lump everyone together, right? To just say, well, we have this strong women's group, so the women's group is going to solve inclusion issues for everyone. And for you to say, time out, that's not why we were created. And you leaders need to support other employee resource groups, or, you know, appoint some leaders or develop some leaders to actually start addressing this. I think it's definitely important. But I wonder, the only thing that I'm curious about, and I don't know who entered this comment, you don't have to reveal yourself, but they put the word other in quotations. So to me, that almost indicates that that leader is saying, we are the group, and then they're the rest of you, right? I don't know, and I could be interpreting that incorrectly. And for those of you who are still with us in chat, if you think that was, if you have a different interpretation of that, oh wow, there's a lot of people saying lots of stuff in chat that I missed. So I want to make sure we go to the chat. But I think that's my only thing, Stephanie, that type of language, if I hear someone else say that, and I'm saying that as a Black woman, I would feel like, okay, well, are you saying that these other groups are less than? Are you saying that they don't deserve the same, that they're not peers with you as an ERG leader? Do you see where I'm going with that?
I totally see where you are. And so I think probably the way that should be said is, I can focus on the issues that I understand, and that we need support, and we need organizations that can focus on the issues that this group isn't focusing on, to make sure we have representation for everyone. Maybe that's the better way to say that.
Yeah, I agree. So there are a few, I want to go over to the chat and Q&A. So Bella, could you just share with us what you're seeing in the chat, and if there are any Q&A questions that maybe we've missed?
Sure. There's a comment in the chat that says, feminism has a difficult history of excluding women of color, and it seems pretty proven that advancing the position/circumstances of white women does not do anything for the advancement of minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, etc., which is a very strong statement. I agree. And then there's a comment about the person who said, concern over the binary nature of this topic, which restricts open dialogue over the fear of consequences, made a great point. I really see that a lot. People will talk privately, but don't want to create controversy with those who don't support for the fear of consequence.
Yeah, and that's something, you know, at the beginning of this session, I talked about that, because that's a part of our agreements, right? Like you're not going to agree with everyone. Everyone is not going to have the same point of view, regardless of if you think because of what they look like or where they live or the work that they do should be in line with your values. They may not be, right? And so it's really important. Like, we can't ever move forward and actually get started with real substantial change if people are not willing to be honest and also take that risk of being wrong. And so we've committed to create this space to where you can get it wrong, where for those of you who have joined our previous sessions, you know, people have really said they've asked questions that might make them look bad. Or, you know, we had someone come on camera in our first session and say, I am 56 years old and I just figured out what white supremacy was and I'm embarrassed. White woman who said this the first session. So no one attacked her, no one shamed her. She had the space to be able to do that and to be able to say that, and also to say, and here's what I've done about it, and here's how I've shifted, and here is how I've shifted my views and my activity, and how I've really re-examined my values because I'm now having this realization, but I'm just embarrassed that I'm just now getting it. Like, I never understood it before now. And so I think it's really important that we continue that and we continue to have those conversations. And one of the things that I've seen in just the responses here is that a lot of people at their companies are struggling just getting started with the conversations. So one comment says silence. The other comment says no one in my group wants to have conversations. There were other people saying like, hey, how do we start having these difficult discussions? So there are a lot of, it sounds like there's a lot of just, hey, how do I get started and actually do anything about this? I see there's some new comments that are coming in the poll, which is awesome. So if you missed the poll the first time, there are a couple of new comments that are coming in. I'm just taking a moment to read them. So do we have another panelist? Because I want to make sure we add the other panelists, because someone else raised their hand, Adriana. I think we had somebody else.
No, that was everybody.
Okay, maybe I imagined that. Alrighty, so I want to address some of these other and kind of kick it to our panelists who are on. So we have global leadership has addressed racial inequality, importance of diversity and inclusion during recent conference calls, but how does it trickle down through the organization? That is a really, really, really good question. So I want to first pose that to our panelists. And Stacy, I want to go back to you. Like, have you seen that at your company? And also, what are some suggestions on how to actually address that? You're on mute. Okay.
That's a really good question, because I think that with all the fervency that happened after the killing of 3 Black people again, you know, there was this heightened sensitivity and this heightened awareness that, you know, we have to move, we got to do something, we have to say something, we have to, you know, and though that's good because it gets the ball rolling. But what happens is you get into this spot of, you know, being debilitated and not really understanding that you have to keep moving, you have to keep doing something. So just for example, my company, which, you know, we had our CEO to come out with a statement. It was a very heartfelt statement. It was one that I think that resonated across a lot of different angles with people, specifically within the organization. And so there was a lot of talk. I was involved in a lot of different activities to try to get our DEI practice, I want to call it a practice, stood up. That has been since June 1st that this message came out, and probably another 3 weeks since the focus groups have gotten out. And I've tried to explain that, yes, I know in the background that things are probably happening, but when you do not include, that X's out the I in inclusion. You have to realize that there's an empathetic path to take that says that not only do we hear you, and there's action that's coming behind it. Here are some of the things we're doing. That's like you're building a house and you have to leave the country for whatever reason, and you need updates, right? You need to understand what's happening. And that's part of what this journey has to be too, because there's some uncomfortable spots that you get to in building up and standing up the foundation of those things that need to happen. And then I just wanted to make another comment that really hit home with Keisha. I know I'm going off of the topic just a tiny bit, but you had mentioned about the Persons of Color efficacy class. And when you think about what are some of the things that we need to look at as individuals within these organizations and across the organization, is where are there opportunities to kind of debunk systemic behaviors. One of them is when you think about competency modeling. You think about, oh, well, we have a competency for this leadership thing. And a lot of times it's about soft skills, right? It's about those things that, do you have leadership skills? Can you communicate? Can you do these particular things? And they clump this together so that if you meet this criteria, then that says you can go to the next level. But if you're trying to embrace diversity, my skill set may look a little different than what is in this competency. Does that mean that I don't get to the next level? So that was just a challenge that was at the top of my mind that I wanted to throw out there. And it's something that we got to start looking at. We have to start looking at the diversity that we bring to the table. And it's a thin line between understanding what things make people successful and what different things can also be included in that competency to make people successful.
So Stacey, I think you just blew up some talent management plans just now with that comment, but it's so true, because how do you, when you start looking at your leadership competencies, but even and I know a lot of oil and gas companies have adopted competency mapping, right? So where they look at individual roles. And so if I am technician 1, how do I move to technician 2? And so I need to meet certain criteria, right? But have we even examined that for bias? Have we looked at, okay, well, are these truly the skills, and is this the aptitude that people need to move to this role? Or have we just modeled it after one type of worker who has been successful?
And it's also different when you think about a soft skill versus a very technical skill, because technical skills are there's a lot less gray area in it, right? Either you can do this activity or you can't. When you talk about leadership skills, it's about that softness. It's about how someone interprets the things that you bring to the table, and it's about behavior. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I know we have another panelist who's joining us. I want to make sure we get to them. Let's see who it is. Yes, Natasha. Welcome.
Hi. Welcome. Thank you. I just wanted to make one comment about when you were asking about how are the different groups or different areas of the organization responding after, and it's been, what I've learned has been really varied. So, we had a really impactful statement, from our U.S. chair, and how each group or organization has responded has really been dependent upon how passionate that leader has been about pushing that change. So some leaders have been more with addressing inequality as a whole, not necessarily just Black Lives Matter, but overall ethnicities, races, religion, sexual orientation, just kind of a statement across all of the the minority or maybe disadvantaged groups, versus other groups have focused specifically on the inequities that and microaggressions that Black people have been experiencing in the organization. So it's been really, really subjective. And a lot of conversation has happened within some groups, where other groups, there's no conversation. And it's so, I don't know if people are afraid to speak up because, it's very politicized, or they don't want to talk about it at all because they don't feel like anything needs to be done. So the silence is what you can't interpret. And a lot of times, especially, as a Black female, I interpret the silence as non-support. And so you may get the conversations individually, and people who are individually supporting, but within the organization, you don't know or don't feel it unless it's explicitly said by a leader. And then moving forward as with action. You know, some groups are so much further along than others within the same organization.
Yeah, so very true. And, you know, I can say this, and I know that I want to respect the fact that everyone is working for their respective companies and they don't necessarily want to make their companies look bad. But the cool thing is I'm not employed by any of them, so I can actually talk about them. And so the two companies that I've been in contact with related to oil and gas, one is Shell, and I know we have a lot of Shell people on the phone and in this session. But what I found was interesting is having two separate conversations, both people employed by Shell, both employed by Shell in Houston. And one said, oh yeah, we're having tons of conversations. We're talking about it, it's coming up, and you know, it's something that we have on our radar. We created a diversity moment in our team meetings to really keep exploring it. We're working on, I mean, like that was one conversation. And I had a separate conversation with another person employed at Shell, same Houston campus. And she said, nothing is happening. Nothing's been said, it's been silent. There was a message that went out from the CEO, but other than that, nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to deal with it. We can't even get support to talk about it. And so I think that actually brings up one of the bigger challenges of working for an oil and gas company, right? Because it's a global entity. And then even within one city and one business unit, you have all of these departments, and depending on what's happening with that leader, Natasha, to your point, depending on how passionate that leader is, that is going to determine what happens in terms of the experience for the individual employee. And so I've seen that at Shell, but I've heard the exact same, like almost identical story from two people who worked at Chevron. Same thing, where it was, hey, our GM did this and this, and you know, he brought the team together, and he was, you know, he's shown so much empathy, and he has us working on these different initiatives. And then another person said they don't want to talk about it. We've got a statement from the Chief Diversity Officer, CEO, a couple of executive sponsors, the Black Employee Network, but on our team and in our business unit, nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to deal with it. And so I'm sure that that's not exclusive just to Shell or Chevron or even just to oil and gas companies, but it is one of the challenges that makes it more complicated, if that makes sense. So I know we are running low on time. I do want to move forward into what do we do now? And so we've talked about some of the data. We've talked about mentorship and sponsorship. I want to actually ask you all, for those of you who are still in the session, what are some of the actions? And I want you to think about individuals, teams, and leaders. Think about some of the commentary that's been shared. We've talked about some of the role of employee resource groups. Stephanie shared about, you know, finding a coalition and starting to build that and really, you know, pushing the issue, but getting other people who are like-minded. We had some people talk about some of the challenges, right? That, hey, this is what's happened since these public killings of Black people, and how it sparked this unrest. And in some organizations, things are happening. Other organizations, there's nothing. And so I'd love for you to respond to the poll. Like, what are some actions that I want you to think about as an individual? Think about what teams can do. Think about what leaders can do. And you can think about this in terms of short-term or long-term. There's no limit to that answer. So I saw somebody say we need to define success. I love that response. One of the things that I've been asking as we've been meeting with leaders and working with clients around how they really help to change the behaviors and the culture in their organization. That's the biggest question that I always ask. Has anyone defined what an equitable workforce looks like at your company? Fill in the blank. And most of the time the answer is no. No one's defined it. Not even the people who are pushing for it, right? So even if I am a Black employee and I'm saying, you know what, this place is not equitable, great, but what does that look like? And let's define it. And let's define it by specific focus areas. Let's look at recruiting and retention, but let's also look at opportunities and development. Let's look at the pipeline. Let's look at sponsorship. You know, let's look at leadership representation. I mean, there are all these different areas. So I see a couple of responses coming in. Be ready to act once you've heard about things that need to change. And doing an equity study. Yes, so that helps us to know like where companies are, because we can assume that, oh, it's not really that bad and it might be worse than what you think. But if you haven't done a study on it or gathered the data, you wouldn't know. D&I program training revamp with input from affected groups and make it a requirement for all employees, not just leadership, to take. That's a really, really good suggestion. So these are actions. So for those of you who came to get some ideas around what can we be doing, these are things that maybe you can action, but it's also some things that you can take back to your respective organizations. Start having the conversation around, okay, listen, we need to define success. When can we schedule some time to start thinking about what success looks like? When can we workshop this? I mean, and if one thing we know that oil and gas companies know how to do, they know how to do projects. Turn it into a project. We know how to do projects. Some other responses, push the message that diversity doesn't fix racism. Wow, I love that. I don't know who said that, but good for you. Companies feel if they work on diversity, they're good. Add a D&I peer review at various levels. That's a good one too. You want some good suggestions. So I want to move on so that we can, I did extend this session until 3:30 only because we had so many people registered. I know there's some other comments in chat, and so if we have time at the very end, I want to make sure we address those. But I want to show you this, and for those of you who have been in our previous sessions, this is our Bold Brave conversation cheat sheet. So these are some things that you can do privately. These are some things you can do with teams, and these are some things that you can do with your leadership. And I show this every time we get together because, one, for the people who have come back, I want to know, where did you fall on this list? Did you do anything? Have you looked at the one thing? Because I think a lot of times when we think about this and we think about this topic, there are a lot of people who say, oh, it's just so overwhelming. You know, like, I don't know where to start. I'm not sure what to do. I don't know how to get the conversation going. But there's a list, like literally look at each column, pick one thing. You don't even have to pick one thing from every column, just pick something. And so we'll show you how to get a copy of this at the end of our session for those of you who don't have it. But I want you to think about how you could literally schedule lunch with one person and have a substantial conversation based on something we talked about in this webinar. And that one conversation could lead to multiple conversations. And those multiple conversations could lead to even more conversations. And then they can lead to action and influence, and then your leadership gets on board. You see what I mean? So this is about us creating a movement around this. And I want to make sure that you all take a moment and think about, what's my one bold, brave action? It doesn't have to be that I'm changing the entire world or putting together an entire strategic plan, but what's the one thing? So I want you to just think about that. And if you have your one thing, I see a couple of people responding in chat. You have your one thing. Yes, I see a few people responding. So if you have your one thing and there's one thing that you've tried or one thing that you're thinking about doing, you know, the first line here under teams is talking about starting small. We talked about building coalition before in response to Brittany's question around, hey, how do I get started? So just like we create a group text for everything, like, hey, I want to have an event, or well, before COVID, pre-COVID, I want to have an event. I want to go to happy hour, or what do you think about what this person said in a meeting? We create a group text and a conversation. You can create a group text that starts a bold, brave conversation. One thing, it's simple, but powerful. So what now? One, I want you to decide on what your one bold, brave action is going to be. And mind you, you don't have to commit this to me. You don't have to commit it to anyone, but I want you to commit to yourselves that you will take one bold, brave action. And obviously, if you need help with that, we are here to help you with that. I also want you to identify your change coalition. So that word is coming up again. And what Stacey shared earlier about finding your accomplices, the people who are going to be in the trenches with you, and not just supporting from a distance, but who are actually going to be along for the journey. And then finally, We do have some further strategic sessions that are coming up for the next phase of Bold Brave. And quickly, I'm going to show you how you can be a part of that. So if you would bear with me just a second. You'll get this in the email, but we have set up this site where you can do everything to follow up in your Bold Brave actions, right? And so we'll continue to build and add content to this site. And so for those of you who joined us before, this is new. So this is the preview. And Adriana will put the link in chat, but it's boldxbrave.com/join. And so there's some of you who didn't get your questions answered. There's some of you who have more that you want to talk about. Every time we do these, I have people who reach out to me and say, hey, Janae, I didn't want to talk about this right now, or I didn't want to dominate the conversation, or I didn't feel comfortable saying it in the webinar. However, there's this thing that I want to talk to you about or get help with. And so we have a way for you to actually book time to do that. You can also subscribe and get updates on the things that we have coming out. You can register for our next webinar. And finally, down here, this is where you can download that Bold Brave cheat sheet that I just showed you. We do have a couple of products that are coming out soon. So a virtual conversation guide and the communications playbook. So this is for organizations to take these conversations like this and to figure out what works for your organization. So the way that we run Bold Brave, it may or may not work for your organization, or you may be able to take elements, but it just gives you some tips on the things to consider and also how to do it in this virtual environment that we're working in right now. And then if you need to reach out to us, the contact information is down there. So I want to just conclude with saying thank you to all of you who joined us. Thank you to all of our panelists. I see a couple of people. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you. I see Stacy. I see a few people who have commented in chat, like I'm trying to read the chat and also talk to you all at the same time. I want to thank my team, Adriana, Bella, who have helped put this together and helped to keep me. They text me like, Janae, you know you're supposed to go on to this next thing, right? Because I'm so passionate about this topic and I will get off topic. And so I want to just thank you all for joining. If you need help, if you have questions, you know how to contact us. Adriana, if you'll put the link in chat so that everyone will get that. And then for those of you, if I'm not connected with you on LinkedIn, let's definitely connect. Let's continue the conversation. We are going to keep this series going. So you have colleagues in the oil and gas industry who need to join, particularly white men. We are looking for white men to join because that's who works in oil and gas. So that just kind of makes sense. And also because we want it to change, like we want to build our change coalition. We need white men to be a part of the Change Coalition. I'm going to say it, right? So bring your white male friend next time when we get together and talk about Bold Brave, which we do have a session that's scheduled for next Friday for those who are available and ready to join. All right, Adriana, Bella, did I miss anything? I'm going to take that silence as a no. Thank you all for joining this afternoon, and I hope to see you again on our next session of Bold Brave.